She thought my empty garage was hers to use, she never imagined it belonged to the county sheriff. It was late Friday evening, the kind of night where the air carried a chill that clung to your bones, and the stars hid behind a veil of heavy clouds. I'd been out all day, dealing with the usual grind, errands, a quick stop at the hardware store, and a long, tedious meeting with a client who couldn't make up their mind. My old sedan rattled as I pulled into the driveway of my fixer-upper farmhouse, the one I'd bought dirt cheap because it sat on the edge of nowhere, just outside the sleepy county line. The motion light above the garage flicked on as I killed the engine, casting a harsh white glow across the gravel. That's when I noticed something was off. The detached garage, a sagging structure with peeling paint and a perpetually leaky roof, wasn't empty. Two massive pickup trucks filled the bays, their hulking frames barely fitting under the low ceiling. Mud caked their oversized tires, leaving dark smears on the concrete floor, and a thin trail of oil glistened in the light, pooling beneath one of the engines. The faint smell of gasoline hung in the air, sharp and acrid, like an uninvited guest. At first, my tired brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe the sheriff's deputies had come early. The county had been leasing my garage for years as overflow storage for their patrol vehicles, mostly dusty SUVs or the occasional impounded car waiting for paperwork to clear. It wasn't glamorous, but the extra cash kept the lights on. I squinted through the windshield, expecting to see the familiar county decals or the glint of a light bar. But these weren't patrol units. Just a pair of beat-up trucks, their beds loaded with dented toolboxes and tangled coils of rope. A bright green sticker on one tailgate caught my eye, proclaiming Green Valley Landscaping in bold, uneven letters. I'd never heard of them, and I knew every small business in this nowhere town. I fumbled for my phone, the screen's glow harsh against the dark. No messages. No missed calls. Not even a curt text from Sheriff Hargrove, who was usually meticulous about coordinating drop-offs. My pulse quickened, a steady thump against my ribs. This wasn't right. Someone had trespassed, had the gall to roll their trucks into my garage like they owned the place. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, the keys still dangling in the ignition. The house loomed in the distance, its windows dark and uninviting. I lived alone, always had since moving out here, and I liked it that way. But now, the isolation felt less like freedom and more like a liability. I stepped out of the car, gravel crunching under my boots, and scanned the yard. The wind rustled through the overgrown pines, their branches swaying like they were whispering secrets. No other vehicles, no strange figures lurking in the shadows, at least, none I could see. My hand hovered over the phone again, debating whether to call Hargrove. He'd probably tell me I was overreacting, that it was just some mix-up. But the hairs on the back of my neck disagreed. I approached the garage cautiously, my footsteps slow and deliberate. The closer I got, the more details stood out. The trucks weren't just old, they were workhorses, battered and scarred from heavy use. One had a cracked windshield, the glass spiderwebbing out from a central point, as if something had hit it hard. The other had a rusty trailer hitch, the kind you'd use to haul serious equipment. I leaned closer to the landscaping sticker, noticing the edges were peeling, the ink faded like it had been slapped on years ago. Something about it felt off, like a prop in a bad play. I circled to the side door of the garage, my hand brushing against the cold metal of the knob. It was unlocked. I froze. I always locked it. The county insisted on it, and I wasn't about to risk losing the lease over carelessness. My heart was pounding now, loud. Enough that I could hear it over the wind. Whoever had parked those trucks hadn't just trespassed, they'd broken in. I pushed the door open, wincing as it creaked on its rusty hinges. The air inside was thick with the smell of grease and something else, something faintly metallic. The light from the motion sensor didn't reach far, leaving the corners of the garage shrouded in shadow. I pulled out my phone again, switching on the flashlight. The beam swept across the trucks, catching on a pile of tarps in the corner, a scattering of tools on a workbench, and, my breath caught, a pair of muddy boots tucked against the wall. They weren't mine. I backed up a step, my mind racing. Call the sheriff? Grab the tire iron from my car? Or just get the hell out of here? Before I could decide, a low rumble broke the silence, not from the trucks, but from somewhere deeper in the property, out toward the old barn I hadn't touched in years. It was faint, like the growl of an engine idling in the distance. My stomach twisted. Whoever had left those trucks wasn't just passing through. They were still here. The next morning, I woke to the pale light of dawn creeping through the frayed curtains of my bedroom. My head throbbed from a restless night, the memory of those trucks in my garage and the distant rumble from the barn gnawing at me. I'd barely slept, jumping at every creak of the old house, half expecting to hear footsteps on the porch. By the time I dragged myself out of bed, the clock read just past 6. I needed answers, and I wasn't waiting for the sheriff's office to open. I threw on a flannel and jeans, grabbed a mug of bitter coffee, and stepped outside. The air was crisp, the kind of autumn morning that promised frost by week's end. The gravel crunched under my boots as I headed toward the garage, the 2 pickup trucks still squatting there like uninvited guests. The mud on their tires had dried overnight, flaking onto the concrete, and the oil stains had spread, dark and slick. The Green Valley Landscaping sticker looked even shabbier in the daylight, its edges curling like it was ashamed to be seen. I was halfway to the garage when I spotted her, Denise, my neighbor, the self-appointed queen of our little stretch of nowhere. She was out in her front yard, a pristine patch of green that looked like it belonged in a magazine, not on the edge of a dusty county road. She stood there in a bright yellow cardigan, watering her roses with a hose, the spray catching the light like a halo. Her smug grin was visible from 50 yards away, the kind of smile that said she knew something you didn't and was enjoying every second of it. "Morning," she called out, her voice syrupy sweet, as if we were old friends catching up over coffee. She didn't even pause her watering, the hose arcing lazily over her flower beds. I didn't bother with pleasantries. I stopped at the edge of her property, arms crossed, and pointed at the garage. "Are those yours?" Denise barely blinked, her eyes flicking toward the trucks before settling back on me. "Oh, yes. My cousin needed a place to park them for a few weeks. I figured you wouldn't mind. That garage just sits there most of the time." The words hit me like a slap. I clenched my jaw so hard my teeth ached, trying to keep my voice steady. She hadn't asked. Hadn't sent a text, hadn't knocked on my door, hadn't even dropped one of her passive-aggressive notes, those HOA-style rules she loved to slip under everyone's doormats, even though our rural patch didn't have a homeowners association. She'd just decided my property was hers to use, like I was some kind of communal storage lot. "You figured I wouldn't mind?" I said, my voice low, each word clipped. "You broke into my garage, Denise. You didn't ask. You didn't even hint." She finally turned off the hose, the water dribbling to a stop. She set it down carefully, like she was handling fine china, and faced me, her grin fading into something harder, more calculating. "Now, don't get dramatic," she said, brushing a strand of perfectly styled hair behind her ear. "It's just a couple of trucks. My cousin's in a bind, his lot got flooded, and he's got nowhere else to store them. I was doing you a favor, really. That garage is an eyesore, just sitting empty like that." I stared at her, dumbfounded. A favor? The nerve of her, acting like she was doing me some grand service by trespassing. My hands balled into fists at my sides, but I kept them there, knowing a shouting match wouldn't get me anywhere with Denise. She had a way of twisting things, making you feel like the unreasonable one. I'd seen it before, when she'd politely demanded the Millers down the road trim their oak tree because it blocked her view, or when she'd left a typed-up list of suggestions for how I should mow my lawn to keep up appearances. "Who's your cousin?" I asked, trying to keep my tone even. "And why didn't he come talk to me himself?" Denise waved a hand, dismissive. "Oh, you don't know him. He's from out of town. Works landscaping, always on the move. I told him I'd handle it. She paused, tilting her head, her eyes narrowing slightly. You're not going to make a big deal out of this, are you? We're neighbors. We help each other out. I wanted to laugh, but there was nothing funny about it. Neighbors didn't break into each other's property. Neighbors didn't make decisions about your land without so much as a phone call. I took a step closer, lowering my voice. You need to get those trucks out of my garage, Denise. Today. And don't ever pull something like this again. Her lips pursed, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flash of something in her eyes, anger, maybe, or something colder. But then she smiled again, that same smug grin, and picked up her hose. I'll let my cousin know, she said, turning the water back on. No need to get worked up. I stood there for a moment, watching her go back to her roses like nothing had happened. My blood was boiling, but I knew arguing further wouldn't get me anywhere. Denise had a knack for dodging accountability, and I wasn't about to let her drag me into her games. I turned back toward the garage, my mind racing. Something about her story didn't add up. A cousin from out of town. A flooded lot. And what about that rumble I'd heard last night, out by the barn? I glanced over my shoulder, catching Denise watching me from the corner of her eye, her smile gone. As I walked back to my property, the unease from last night crept back in. Those trucks weren't just a neighborly overstep. They were a message, and I had a sinking feeling I hadn't heard the end of it. I could have yelled right there in Denise's pristine front yard, let loose all the frustration boiling inside me until the whole county heard it. But instead, I forced a smile, tight and thin, the kind that didn't reach my eyes. Denise, still clutching her hose like a scepter, didn't know the half of it. She thought she'd pulled a fast one, dumping her cousin's trucks in my garage like it was just another of her neighborly power plays. But that garage? It wasn't mine to lend out, not in the way she assumed. And that mistake was about to bite her. 2 years ago, I'd been scraping by, the farmhouse's mortgage and noose around my neck. The place was a money pit, leaky pipes, a sagging roof, and a heater that groaned like it was auditioning for a horror movie. Then Sheriff Hargrove came knocking with an offer. The county sheriff's department was out of space at their main lot, and my detached garage, run down as it was big enough to store a couple of patrol units or impounded vehicles when the need arose. I signed a contract, ironclad and notarized, complete with the sheriff's looping signature and the county seal stamped in blue ink. In exchange for a modest monthly check, the garage became an official county facility, locked tight and off-limits to anyone without clearance. I wasn't even allowed to store my own tools in there without permission. Meaning? Denise hadn't just trespassed on my property. She hadn't just broken into my garage. She'd parked her cousin's muddy, oil-leaking trucks in a county-controlled space, violating a government contract. And that wasn't just rude, it was illegal. The kind of illegal that could bring deputies to her door, asking questions she wouldn't want to answer. I turned away from Denise, my smile still plastered on, and started back toward my house. My boots crunched against the gravel, each step steadying my resolve. I could feel her eyes boring into my back, probably wondering why I hadn't exploded. Let her wonder. I wasn't about to tip my hand, not yet. Inside, my mind was racing, piecing together the next move. I needed to call Hargrove, but first, I wanted to see those trucks again, to make sure I hadn't missed anything in the dark last night. The morning sun was higher now, casting long shadows across the yard. The garage loomed ahead, its faded red paint peeling like old skin. I unlocked the side door, using my key this time, not the one Denise had somehow gotten her hands on, and stepped inside. The air was still heavy with the smell of gasoline and grease, and those trucks looked even more out of place in the daylight. The Green Valley Landscaping sticker was still there, peeling and faded, but now I noticed something else, a faint scratch on the tailgate, like someone had tried to pry it open and given up. I crouched down, running my finger along the edge. The metal was cold, the scratch fresh, with no rust or grime in the grooves. I stood and circled the trucks, my phone's flashlight app casting a narrow beam into the cabs. The driver's seat of the first truck was littered with fast food wrappers and a crumpled pack of cigarettes. A thermos rolled on the floorboard, clinking against a wrench. The second truck was cleaner, almost too clean, like it had been wiped down in a hurry. In the bed, under a tarp, I spotted a glimpse of something metallic, a chain, maybe, or part of a machine. I didn't touch it. Not yet. But my gut told me these weren't just landscaping trucks, and Denise's cousin story was starting to smell as bad as the oil on the floor. I pulled out my phone and snapped a few pictures, license plates, the sticker, the scratches, the tarps. Evidence, just in case. Then I dialed Hargrove's direct line, the one he'd given me for emergencies. It rang twice before his gruff voice answered. "Sheriff Hargrove." "It's me," I said, keeping my voice low, though I wasn't sure why. "We've got a problem at the garage. Someone parked 2 trucks in there last night. Not county vehicles. My neighbor says they belong to her cousin, but she didn't ask permission. The door was unlocked when I found them." There was a pause, long enough that I could hear the creak of his chair as he leaned back. "Unlocked," he said, his tone sharpening. "Yeah. And I always lock it. You know that." Another pause. "You sure it's not one of ours? Sometimes the night shift." "Not yours," I cut in. "These are old pickups, landscaping decals. Muddy tires, leaking oil. They don't belong here." Hargrove let out a slow breath, the kind that said he was already dreading the paperwork. "All right. Sit tight. I'll send someone over to check it out. Don't touch anything, and don't let anyone near those trucks." "Got it," I said, but my eyes were already drifting back to the garage, to the tarps and the scratches and the boots I'd seen last night. I hung up and stepped outside, locking the door behind me. Across the road, Denise was still in her yard, pruning her roses now, her movements sharp and precise. She glanced up, catching my eye, and for a split second, her face wasn't smug or calculating, it was nervous. I didn't wave. I didn't smile. I just stood there, letting her see me watching. Denise had crossed a line, and whether she knew it or not, she just dragged herself, and her mysterious cousin, into something much bigger than a neighborly spat. The rumble I'd heard last night echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that those trucks were only the beginning. The morning air was sharp, carrying the faint bite of autumn as I stood on the edge of my property, staring across the road at Denise. She was still in her yard, her pruning shears flashing in the sunlight as she trimmed her roses with surgical precision. The smugness in her posture, the way she held herself like she owned the whole damn county, made my blood simmer. But I wasn't here to start a fight, not yet. Out of some misplaced sense of courtesy, or maybe just to cover my bases, I decided to give her one chance to fix this before the sheriff's deputies rolled in. I crossed the road, my boots kicking up dust, and stopped a few feet from her perfectly manicured lawn. "Denise," I said, keeping my voice calm but firm, "you need to move those trucks today. That garage isn't mine right now, it belongs to the sheriff's office. If they show up and see those, they won't be happy." She didn't even look up at first, just snipped another rose stem and let it fall into a neat pile at her feet. Then, slowly, she straightened, her eyes rolling so dramatically I could almost hear them. "Oh, please," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Nobody cares. It's just a garage. You act like you're so important with your little contracts. My cousin will move them when he's done with his jobs. Don't make such a fuss." Her arrogance was staggering, like a slap I hadn't seen coming. I stood there, hands on my hips, letting her words hang in the air. She didn't know, or maybe she didn't care, that she'd just admitted to breaking into a county facility, that her cousin's trucks weren't just an inconvenience but a violation that could land her in real trouble. I studied her face, searching for a crack in that smug facade, but all I saw was defiance. Her lips pursed like she was daring me to push harder. "Denise," I said, my voice dropping lower, "this isn't a game. That contract is real, and so are the consequences. The sheriff's office doesn't mess around. Get those trucks out, or they'll handle it for you." She laughed, a short, sharp bark that grated on my nerves. "You're so dramatic," she said, waving her shears dismissively. "Go back to your little farmhouse and relax. My cousin's got this under control. He's busy, you know, actually working for a living." She turned back to her roses, snipping another stem with a flourish, as if I'd been dismissed. I didn't move. I just stood there, letting the weight of her words sink in. Working for a living. The jab stung, but it wasn't about me. It was about her, her need to control everything, to bend the world to her rules. I'd dealt with people like Denise before, small-town tyrants who thought they could bully their way through life. But this wasn't about a trimmed hedge or a noisy lawnmower. She'd crossed a line, and her refusal to back down was only digging her deeper. "Fine," I said, my voice cold. "Have it your way." I turned and walked back to my property, feeling her eyes on me again, that same nervous flicker I'd caught before buried under her bravado. She could play tough all she wanted, but I knew she wasn't as confident as she pretended. Back at the garage, I pulled out my phone and opened the camera. If Denise wasn't going to listen, I'd make sure everything was documented. I snapped more photos, the truck's license plates, the oil stains spreading across the concrete, the scratched tailgate, the tarp in the back of the second truck that hid something I still couldn't quite make out. I zoomed in on the Green Valley Landscaping sticker, noting how the ink was smudged in one corner, like it had been printed in someone's basement. Every detail mattered. If this went south, and my gut told me it would, I wasn't going to be the one caught off guard. I sent the photos to Sheriff Hargrove with a quick text, "Truck's still here. Neighbor refusing to move them. Let me know when your guys are coming." Then I locked the garage door, double-checking the deadbolt this time. The rumble I'd heard last night still lingered in my mind, a nagging loose thread. Denise's cousin, whoever he was, wasn't just parking trucks. There was something else going on, something tied to that metallic glint under the tarp, those muddy boots, that unlocked door. I glanced toward the old barn at the edge of my property, its weathered boards barely holding together. The rumble had come from that direction, I was sure of it. Part of me wanted to march over there, throw open the doors, and see what was hiding inside. But another part, the part that had survived years of living alone out here, told me to wait. Hargrove's deputies would be here soon, and they'd have questions for Denise and her mysterious cousin. Questions she clearly wasn't ready to answer. I headed back to the house, my coffee long cold in its mug. As I passed the garage, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, not by Denise, but by something else, something waiting just out of sight. I set the mug on the porch railing and scanned the tree line, the barn, the road. Nothing moved. But the air felt heavy, like a storm was brewing, and I knew Denise's dismissal of my warning was going to cost her more than she realized. Monday morning broke cold and gray, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain. I'd spent the weekend on edge, checking the garage lock every few hours and keeping my phone close, waiting for Sheriff Hargrove's deputies to show up. Denise hadn't made a move to remove the trucks, and her smug dismissal still burned in my chest. I'd caught glimpses of her through my kitchen window, tending her roses like nothing was wrong, but I hadn't seen her so-called cousin or heard that strange rumble from the barn again. The silence was almost worse, it felt like the calm before a storm. Around 8, the crunch of tires on gravel pulled me to the front porch. A county sheriff's SUV rolled into the driveway, its light bar glinting dully under the overcast sky. 2 deputies stepped out, both in crisp uniforms, their boots polished despite the dust. They were here to rotate out a patrol unit, a routine swap I'd seen dozens of times since signing the lease. I leaned against the porch railing, coffee mug in hand, and watched as they headed for the garage, their strides purposeful. But the moment they swung open the main door and saw those muddy pickup trucks clogging their assigned bays, their expressions shifted from routine boredom to confusion, then fury. "Whose the hell are these?" the taller deputy, a guy named Martinez with a buzz cut and a permanent scowl, barked. He stood with his hands on his hips, staring at the trucks like they'd personally insulted him. The Green Valley Landscaping sticker seemed to mock him from the tailgate, its peeling edges curling in the damp air. I shrugged, keeping my tone neutral despite the satisfaction creeping in. "Not mine. Neighbor decided my garage was her cousin's storage lot." The second deputy, a younger woman named Ellis with sharp eyes and a notepad already in hand, crouched to inspect the oil stains spreading across the concrete. "You're kidding," she muttered, glancing up at me. "She just parked them here. Without asking?" "Yep," I said, taking a sip of coffee. "Told her to move them. She didn't care. Said her cousin's busy and it's no big deal." Martinez snorted, shaking his head as he peered into the cab of the nearest truck. "Busy, huh? Busy breaking the law." He kicked a clump of dried mud off a tire, and it crumbled onto the floor. "This is a county facility. She's got no business here." Ellis was already on her radio, her voice clipped as she relayed the situation to dispatch. "We've got unauthorized vehicles in the leased garage at 472, County Road. 2 pickups, not county property. Requesting further instructions." I stayed quiet, letting them do their thing. Martinez circled the trucks, his flashlight sweeping over the dented toolboxes and the tarp in the back of the second one. He paused, leaning closer to the tarp, but didn't touch it. "You see anyone around these?" he asked, glancing at me. "Not since Friday night," I said. "Heard a noise out by my barn that night, though. Like an engine. Haven't checked it out yet." His eyes narrowed, but he didn't press. Instead, he muttered something to Ellis about securing the scene. The air felt heavier now, the deputy's irritation shifting into something more serious. I stepped back, giving them space, but my mind was racing. Denise's arrogance had landed her in deep water, and I couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction at the thought of her facing the consequences. Within 30 minutes, another vehicle pulled up, a black SUV with the sheriff's department logo on the side. Sheriff Collins himself stepped out, his jaw tight and a clipboard clutched in one hand. I'd only met Collins a handful of times, usually when he was signing off on lease paperwork or inspecting the garage. He was a no-nonsense type, broad-shouldered and graying at the temples, with the kind of stare that made you feel like he was sizing up your entire life in one glance. Today, he looked like he'd been dragged out of bed and wasn't happy about it. "What's going on here?" he said, striding toward the garage. His voice was low but carried the weight of authority. Martinez and Ellis snapped to attention, filling him in as he paced the length of the trucks, his boots echoing on the concrete. He stopped at the oil stains, then at the scratched tailgate, his pen scratching furiously on the clipboard. "This is county property under active lease," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "Unauthorized vehicles, trespassing and obstruction. Maybe more, depending on what's in those beds." He glanced at me, his eyes narrowing. "You know who did this?" "My neighbor, Denise," I said, nodding toward her house across the road. Her roses were still in view, but she was nowhere to be seen. Probably watching from her window, I figured. She said they belonged to her cousin. I told her to move them, but she blew me off. Colin's jaw tightened further, if that was even possible. "She broke into a county facility," he said, his voice flat but edged with anger. "That's not just a neighborly dispute. That's a crime." He turned to Martinez. "Run the plates. I want to know who this cousin is and what he's hauling. And get a tow truck out here. These need to be impounded." Martinez nodded and headed back to the SUV, while Ellis started taking photos, her camera flashing in the dim garage. Collins turned to me, his expression softening just a fraction. You did the right thing calling this in. We'll handle it from here. But I need you to stay clear of the garage until we're done. And if you hear that noise again, or see anything else, you call me directly." "Understood," I said, handing him my phone with the photos I'd taken. He scrolled through them, his frown deepening at the image of the tarp and the scratches. He didn't say anything, but the way he lingered on the screen told me he saw the same red flags I did. As Collins and the deputies got to work, I glanced across the road again. Denise's front door was cracked open now, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of her silhouette in the doorway. She wasn't smiling anymore. I didn't wave, didn't acknowledge her. I just turned back to my house, the weight of the moment settling over me. Denise had ignored my warning, and now the sheriff was here, clipboard in hand, ready to tear her little scheme apart. But something told me this wasn't just about trucks or a nosy neighbor. Whatever was under that tarp, whatever had made that rumble by the barn, was about to pull us all into something much bigger than a lease violation. The tow trucks rolled in just before noon, their engines rumbling like a low growl that cut through the quiet of the morning. 2 hulking flatbeds maneuvered into my driveway, their tires crunching gravel and kicking up dust that swirled in the gray light. The deputies, Martinez and Ellis, stood by the garage, directing the drivers with clipped gestures, while Sheriff Collins oversaw the operation, his clipboard tucked under one arm, his face unreadable. I leaned against my porch railing, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold like a slow-motion train wreck. The air was thick with tension, and I knew it was about to get worse. Across the road, Denise's front door flew open with a bang. She came charging out, her yellow cardigan flapping like a warning flag, her face twisted in a mix of panic and fury. "You can't take those," she screamed, her voice shrill enough to startle a pair of crows from the pines. She stormed across her pristine lawn, bare feet slipping on the damp grass, and pointed a trembling finger at the tow truck drivers as they hooked chains to the first of her cousin's pickups. "That's my cousin's livelihood. You have no right." Sheriff Collins didn't flinch. He turned to face her, his broad frame steady as a brick wall, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Ma'am, your cousin trespassed on county-leased property. These vehicles are being impounded, and he'll face fines, maybe more, depending on what we find. You may want to call a lawyer." Denise froze mid-step, her mouth half open as if she'd been slapped. Her face drained of color, going pale as the clouds overhead, then flushed a deep, angry red. For a moment, I thought she might actually charge at Collins, but she spun toward me instead, her eyes blazing. "This is your fault," she shrieked, jabbing a finger in my direction. "You petty, vindictive little nobody. You couldn't just let it go, could you? Calling the sheriff like some self-important snitch." I didn't move, didn't blink. Her words stung, but I'd heard worse, and I wasn't about to let her drag me into her meltdown. "You broke into my garage, Denise," I said, my voice low and steady. "You were warned. This is on you." She didn't stop. Her voice rose higher, a string of names and insults spilling out, nosy, spiteful, troublemaker, words that would have made a weaker person flinch. Then she threw in the kicker, "I'll get the HOA involved. They'll make you regret this." Martinez, who'd been watching the tow truck driver secure the first pickup, let out a bark of laughter. "Lady, there is no HOA here," he said, shaking his head. Ellis smirked, her camera still in hand as she snapped a final photo of the second truck's license plate. Denise's mouth snapped shut, her eyes darting between the deputies, the tow trucks, and me, like a cornered animal realizing the trap had sprung. The tow truck drivers worked fast, their chains clanking as they hoisted the first pickup onto the flatbed. The Green Valley Landscaping sticker caught the light one last time before the truck was secured, its muddy tires dangling uselessly. The second truck followed, its tarp shifting slightly as it was lifted, revealing a glimpse of something metallic underneath, maybe a chain, maybe something heavier. I made a mental note to mention it to Collins later. Whatever was under there, it wasn't just landscaping tools. Denise's shouts grew hoarse as the trucks were hauled off, their engines roaring as they pulled out of the driveway and onto the county road. Her voice echoed down the street, a fading wail of outrage and desperation that made the neighbors' curtains twitch. Old Mr. Miller peeked out from his porch 2 houses down, his hound dog baying softly at the commotion. Across the road, Denise's perfect lawn seemed to mock her, its neat edges and blooming roses a stark contrast to the chaos she'd unleashed. Collins approached me as the tow trucks disappeared around the bend, his clipboard back in hand. "We'll run the plates and track down this cousin of hers," he said, his tone clipped but professional. "If he's got half a brain, he'll show up to claim the trucks and pay the fines. If not," he trailed off, his eyes flicking toward Denise's house. "We'll be having a longer conversation." "What about her?" I asked, nodding toward Denise, who was now pacing her driveway, her phone pressed to her ear, probably calling her mysterious cousin or that lawyer Collins had suggested. "She'll get a summons," he said. "Trespassing, tampering with a county facility, maybe aiding and abetting, depending on what we find." "You got those photos you took?" I nodded, pulling out my phone and forwarding the images to him again. "There's something under the tarp in the second truck," I said. Couldn't tell what, but it didn't look like gardening gear. Collins' eyes narrowed, and he gave a curt nod. "Noted. We'll take a look when they're processed at the impound lot." He paused, glancing at me. "You keep your eyes open, all right? If that noise you heard by the barn comes back, or if you see anyone poking around, you call me. Day or night?" "Will do," I said, my gaze drifting to the old barn at the edge of my property. Its weathered boards looked more ominous now, the gaps between them like dark eyes watching. That rumble I'd heard Friday night felt closer than ever, a puzzle piece that didn't fit with Denise's story about her cousin's flooded lot. As Collins and the deputies packed up and drove off, I glanced across the road. Denise was still on her phone, her voice a low, furious mutter now. She caught my eye and froze, her expression a mix of rage and something else, fear, maybe, or guilt. I didn't wave, didn't acknowledge her. I just turned back to my house, the weight of the morning settling over me like a storm cloud. Denise had ignored my warning, and now the consequences were rolling out, one tow truck at a time. But something told me this wasn't over. Whatever her cousin was hiding, whatever was under that tarp, was going to pull us both deeper into trouble than either of us could have imagined. By evening, the news had spread like wildfire through our sleepy stretch of county road. The tow truck's departure had been the spark, and now the whole neighborhood was buzzing. Old Mr. Miller sat on his porch, sipping sweet tea and muttering to his hound dog about that damn Denise. The Wilsons next door lingered by their mailbox, whispering to each other as their kids rode bikes in lazy circles, stealing glances at Denise's house. Even the reclusive widow at the end of the road, Mrs. Carter, poked her head out to ask what all the fuss was about. In a place where nothing much happened, a sheriff's showdown and 2 impounded trucks were the scandal of the decade. I stayed on my porch, nursing a lukewarm beer as the day faded into a chilly dusk. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, but the usual quiet was broken by the hum of gossip. Across the road, Denise's house stood out like a sore thumb, its pristine lawn and blooming roses mocked by the empty driveway and the faint echo of her earlier meltdown. She'd been pacing her porch since the tow trucks left, her phone glued to her ear, her voice rising and falling in frantic bursts. Now, she was nowhere in sight, but the neighborhood hadn't forgotten her. Kids pointed and giggled when she stormed past earlier, her yellow cardigan swapped for a rumpled sweatshirt, her hair no longer perfectly styled. The queen of the block was crumbling, and everyone was watching. Denise had tried to spin the story, of course. I'd overheard her earlier, cornering Mrs. Wilson by the mailbox, her voice shrill with indignation. "He set me up," she'd insisted, jabbing a finger toward my house. "He's been looking for a way to make me look bad ever since I moved here. That garage was just sitting there, and my cousin needed help. It's not a crime to be a good family member." But Mrs. Wilson just nodded politely, her eyes darting away, and the story didn't stick. Everyone knew Denise for what she was: entitled, bossy, and reckless. Her HOA notes, her complaints about unmowed lawns, her insistence on keeping up appearances, they'd worn out her welcome long before she broke into my garage. This was just the final straw. As for her cousin, the mysterious landscaper with the muddy trucks, he wasn't thanking her for her so-called favor. Around mid-afternoon, a beat-up sedan had screeched into Denise's driveway, and out stepped a wiry man in his 30s, his flannel shirt stained with sweat and his face twisted with rage. I couldn't hear every word from my porch, but I didn't need to, the whole block heard him cursing her out. "You said it was fine," he shouted, his voice carrying over the pines. "You said it was your friend's garage, no problem. Now I've got trespassing charges and thousands in impound fees. You screwed me, Denise." She tried to calm him, her hands flailing as she followed him back to his car, but he wasn't having it. He slammed the door and peeled out, leaving her standing alone in the driveway, her face a mask of shock and humiliation. I took a sip of my beer, the bitter taste grounding me. Part of me felt a grim satisfaction watching Denise's world unravel. She'd brought this on herself, ignoring my warning, acting like the rules didn't apply to her. But another part of me couldn't shake the unease that had been building since Friday night. Those trucks weren't just a mistake, they were a problem. The scratches on the tailgate, the tarp hiding something heavy, the rumble by the barn that still hadn't been explained. Denise's cousin wasn't just a landscaper caught in a bad spot. There was something else going on, something bigger, and I had a sinking feeling I was still caught in the middle of it. As the sky darkened, I noticed a figure lingering at the edge of my property, near the old barn. It was too far to make out details. Just a shadow against the fading light, but my pulse quickened. I set the beer down and stood, squinting into the dusk. The figure didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there for a moment before slipping back into the trees. My first thought was Denise, maybe snooping to salvage her pride, but the shape was wrong, taller, broader. Her cousin? Or someone else entirely? I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the barn, my boots crunching on the gravel. The air was colder now, the wind carrying a faint metallic tang, like the smell in the garage. When I reached the barn, its weathered doors creaked in the breeze, the padlock still secure but the boards loose enough for someone to slip through. I shone the flashlight inside, the beam catching on cobwebs and rusted tools, but nothing else. No tracks, no signs of disturbance. Yet the hairs on my neck stood up, and that rumble from Friday night echoed in my mind. Back at the house, I locked the doors and checked my phone. No word from Sheriff Collins yet, but I knew he'd be digging into those trucks, running the plates, checking what was under that tarp. Denise's cousin was in deep, and she dragged herself down with him. The neighborhood might be done with her, but I had a feeling this wasn't the end. Whatever was hiding in those trucks, or out by my barn, was still out there, and it wasn't done with me yet. A week later, the dust had settled, and the county road felt quieter than it had in years. The crisp October air carried the scent of fallen leaves, and the pines swayed gently in the breeze, as if the world itself was exhaling. I was out front, patching a crack in the porch steps with a can of sealant, when the familiar rumble of a sheriff's SUV pulled into my driveway. I straightened, wiping my hands on my jeans, and saw Sheriff Collins step out, his broad frame moving with a rare ease. For the first time since this mess started, he was grinning, a tight, satisfied smile that said he'd closed a case and liked the outcome. "Appreciate your quick reporting," he said, striding up to the porch. He held out a crisp manila envelope, the county seal embossed on the corner. "We like having reliable partners. Folks like her give us job security." He nodded toward Denise's house across the road, his grin widening just a fraction. I took the envelope, recognizing the weight of official paperwork. Inside was a fresh copy of the lease extension for the garage, the terms unchanged but the dates pushed out another year. A small gesture, maybe, but it felt like a nod of respect from a man who didn't hand them out lightly. I laughed, a short, relieved sound, and shook his hand, his grip firm and steady. Glad I could help, I said. And glad to keep the garage in good hands. Collins tipped his hat, a rare touch of old-school courtesy. You did more than help. You caught a problem before it got worse. That cousin of hers? He's not just paying fines. We found some questionable items under that tarp, nothing you need to worry about, but let's just say he's got more than landscaping on his plate. My eyebrows lifted, but I didn't press. The metallic glint I'd seen, the rumble by the barn, the scratched tailgate, it all pointed to something shadier than a flooded lot. I'd suspected as much, but hearing it from Collins made it real. What about Denise? I asked, glancing across the road. Her house looked quieter now, the roses still blooming but the driveway empty, no sign of her usual flurry of activity. She's laying low, Collins said, his tone dry. Got a summons for aiding and abetting, plus a fine for tampering with county property. She's lucky it's not worse. Her cousin's not exactly singing her praises, either. Word is, he's blaming her for the whole mess. He shook his head, a faint chuckle escaping. She might think twice before pulling a stunt like that again. I nodded, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. For the first time in months, peace had returned to my property. No more unauthorized vehicles clogging the garage, no more oil stains or peeling landscaping stickers. No more smug neighbor strutting around like she owned the place. The garage was secure, the lease renewed, and the sheriff's department had my back. It wasn't just a win, it was a reclamation of my space, my boundaries, my quiet life. As Collins drove off, I leaned against the porch railing, the envelope still in hand. The neighborhood had changed since last week's showdown. Old Mr. Miller waved from his porch, his hound dog sprawled at his feet, no longer muttering about Denise but about the weather instead. The Wilson kids rode their bikes past my house, shouting hellos instead of pointing at Denise's. Even Mrs. Carter, the widow who rarely left her house, had left a jar of homemade jam on my doorstep with a note that read, "Good for you," standing up to her. Denise's empire of fake authority, built on passive-aggressive notes and self-righteous glares, was crumbling with every sideways glance from the neighbors. Across the road, Denise's curtains stayed closed. I'd seen her only once since the tow trucks left, hurrying to her mailbox with her head down, her usual cardigan replaced by a plain jacket, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. She didn't look my way, didn't wave, didn't try to spin another story. The neighborhood's whispers had done their work, she was no longer the queen of the block, just a woman who'd overplayed her hand and lost. Her cousin's curses still echoed in my mind, a public humiliation she couldn't talk her way out of. She'd thought she could use me, could decide for me, could treat my property like an extension of her own little kingdom. But in the end, she'd learned the hard way, the garage she tried to steal wasn't mine to give. It belonged to the law. I tucked the lease extension inside and headed to the garage, checking the lock out of habit. The concrete floor was clean now, the oil stains scrubbed away, the air free of gasoline and grease. But as I turned to head back to the house, my eyes drifted to the old barn at the edge of the property. The rumble I'd heard that first night still nagged at me, a loose thread in an otherwise tidy resolution. Collins hadn't mentioned it, and I hadn't heard it since, but the memory lingered, sharp and unsettling. I scanned the tree line, half expecting to see that shadowy figure again, but the dusk was still, the pines swaying gently. For now, I'd won. Denise was humbled, the trucks were gone, and the sheriff's department had my back. But as I locked the front door and settled into the quiet of my house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, waiting in the shadows of the barn or beyond. The law had reclaimed the garage, but whatever had been under that tarp, whatever had caused that rumble, wasn't done with me yet.